We've all heard the story of Esther, but what if I told you that there was another angle to the story that happened long before the first chapter even took place? There's a forgotten book in the Apocrypha called the Additions of ESTHER. And today I'm going to tell you the whole story. It all starts around the 5th century BC in the city of Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, approximately 100 years after the Babylonian captivity. Now, some Hebrews have returned to Jerusalem, but some decided to stay behind, like this guy. His name is Mordecai, and he's a Hebrew from the tribe of Benjamin. Well, one day he has a dream where he hears thunder and earthquakes, and two great dragons appear and prepare for battle. A flood pours out, threatening to destroy the righteous along with the wicked. But then a tiny spring emerges and grows into a river. The river brings light and the darkness is pushed back. And when Mordecai awakes, he's disturbed, as he should be, because he knows that this dream is somehow about kingdoms, lineage, and war. He also knows it's from Yah, and he knows it's for instruction. So he holds on to the vision and waits for Yah to reveal what he wants him to do. Now, Mordecai, he sits at the king's gate. He's probably like a low-level administrator or civil servant. He's probably working in a palace in some sort of modest capacity. And the king he serves is this guy, King Artaxerxes. He's the most powerful man in the world, and he rules 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia with absolute authority. But he's also impulsive, also reactive with his emotions, and easily persuaded, and heavily relies on his advisors. One day during a 187-day celebration, but really it was just a grand spectacle to display his greatness and his power, he petitioned his wife, Queen Vashti, and demanded that she accompany him so that he could show off her beauty. Now, this is the last day of the feast, and he is super drunk. And she's probably thinking, not this again. So she refuses his demand, which embarrasses him and makes him absolutely furious. So he orders her to be stripped of her queenship and permanently banished from his presence. So now the king is without a queen, and he doesn't like this. So he sends out a royal decree for what would be the equivalent today of a mandatory beauty pageant. The criteria for this pageant, well, they have to be acceptable age, they must be beautiful, and they must be a virgin. Now, it just so happened that Mordecai had a beautiful niece. Her name is Hadassah. That's her Hebrew name. And her Persian name is Esther. Now, Esther is an orphan, so Mordecai had raised her from childhood. She was beautiful, she was a virgin, and she was acceptable age to marry. So legally, she was obligated to participate in this pageant, because that's what we're calling it. Now, when Artaxerxes sees Esther, he's completely taken with her beauty. And long story short, he chose her to be the queen of Persia. So before all of this, Mordecai had told her to keep her Hebrew ethnicity a secret and not to reveal it to anyone. So there she was, the queen of the world's most powerful empire. But she never compromised the statutes of the Most High. In the Additions of ESTHER, we learn that she did not rejoice in the royal luxury or take pleasure in the crown. She also rejected all of Persia's idols. And Esther, she found favor because Yah was positioning her for a divine purpose. This is so amazing. An Israelite woman now sat on the throne of Persia, hidden and waiting for Yah's perfect timing. So Mordecai, he continued to sit at the king's gate, and one day he overheard two officials plotting to assassinate the king. Mordecai goes and informs Esther, and Esther warned the king in Mordecai's name. So the men were arrested and executed immediately, and Mordecai's name was written in the royal chronicles. But Mordecai was forgotten, or so it seems. Now that brings us to this guy, Haman. Now, Haman is not a Persian. He's an Agagite, a descendant of Esau and the Amalekites. Remember 1 Samuel 15? Go look it up. Now, for some reason, Haman is the king's top official, and the king had appointed him to be the highest position in the kingdom, and demanded that everyone bow down to him and pay him homage. Go figure. One day, Mordecai sees Haman and refuses to bow, because that's not what Hebrews do. They only bow to Yah. And this completely ignited Haman's anger towards Mordecai. So Haman does a little intel on Mordecai and discovers that, yeah, he's a Hebrew. So he goes to the king. Now remember, the king is super impulsive and relies heavily on his advisors. So Haman tells him, look, there's these people. They call themselves Hebrews. And they are a rebellious and dangerous people. They follow their own decrees and ignore all of your laws. So Xerxes trusts Haman without question, and he foolishly gives him a decree to exterminate all of the Hebrews in the empire. So a decree was written, and it was sealed with the king's ring and sent throughout the empire. And now every man, woman, and child is marked for destruction. When Mordecai heard the news, he tore his garments, and he covered himself in sackcloth and ashes, and he mourned publicly. Esther heard of his distress and summoned him, and he urged her to go before the king. And he was like, look, who knows if you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this? If you remain silent, I'm sure deliverance will arise another way. But you will perish. But here's the thing. Approaching the king uninvited is punishable by death, even for the queen. And Esther hadn't been summoned by the king in 30 days. So now Esther is faced with a big decision that could cost her her life. But if she does nothing, her people could perish. So she removes her royal garments, and she covers herself in sackcloth and ashes, and she cries out to the Most High Yah of Abraham. So she sent word to Mordecai and instructed all of the Jews in Susa to fast and pray for 3 days and 3 nights, which she also did with her maidservants. And after the 3rd day, she dressed in her royal garments, and she approached the king, uninvited. The additions tell us that she was so scared that her strength left her under the crushing weight of what she carried. Not for fear of rejection, it was fear of annihilation. But when the king saw her, he had compassion and extended his golden scepter and asked her what concerned her. And he offered her anything she wanted, up to half his kingdom. But instead of pouring out her concerns, she merely invited him and Haman to a banquet. So now, even during the banquet, she kept her requests to herself and invited them back the following night. And while Esther waited, Haman, well, he was busy between those 2 banquets, building those gallows extra tall, just for Mordecai. And that night, the king, well, he had a real bad case of insomnia. So he had his servants come in and read the royal chronicles. So then he was reminded about Mordecai and how he saved his life. Remember the assassination plot? Well, he realized that Mordecai had never been rewarded for all of his loyalty. The next day, Haman enters the king's chambers to specifically request Mordecai's execution. But before he could speak, the king asked him, hey, what's the best way to honor a man who pleased the king? Haman was completely full of himself, and he thought that the king was referring to him. So Haman says, well, I think you should dress him in royal robes and lead him around on the king's royal horse and have a royal official proclaim his greatness. So he's like, very well, let this be done to Mordecai. Can you imagine Haman's rage? He's forced now to parade his sworn enemy through the streets in royal splendor. And since he's the highest ranking royal official, he's the one who has to shout the greatness of a man he absolutely hates. So after all that, Esther, the king, and Haman are at the final banquet. And Esther, well, she spills all the tea. She reveals everything, her lineage, her people, and most importantly, Haman's wicked plan to exterminate them all. Well, the king, he was absolutely enraged, and he stormed out of the room. So now Haman, he's desperate, and he throws himself at the mercy of Esther, and he is begging for his life. When the king returns and he sees Haman falling all over Esther, well, he assumes that he's trying to assault her or get with her or something shady. Now remember, this guy is impulsive and he goes ballistic. So he immediately has Haman executed on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So now Haman is dead and Mordecai's been elevated to a high position with the king. But their troubles aren't over yet. You see, once a king makes a decree and seals it with his ring, it's ironclad and it can't be undone, not even by the king himself. And you know what that reminds me of? Yah, because his commandments and his statutes can't be undone either. So instead of revoking the decree to kill everyone, because he can't, because he's the king, and he can't take back his word, he made a second decree permitting that all of the Hebrews can defend themselves with weapons. So their enemies fell, and Haman's sons and his entire lineage were destroyed. And many people from that day forward attached themselves to the Hebrew people because they recognized the Most High Yah ruled over history. So remember in the beginning when Mordecai had the dream about the two dragons? Well, now he finally understood it. The two dragons were him and Haman. Esther was the stream that grew into the river. The flood and the light, well, this was covenant warfare. So as you can see, this is not a story without Yah like we've all been told. His name was spoken. Yah was clearly sought. And he was absolutely central in the whole mix. I mean, this is spiritual warfare. Obedience did not disappear in exile. Faith did not vanish in the absence of the temple. So if you want to hear more stories like this that you didn't learn in Sunday school, well, I hope that you subscribe and you share, and I hope to see you next week.